I left India with $1,100 folded into a sock. I spent 34 years cleaning floors, unloading trucks in the freezing cold, and saving every dollar I could, just to open one small Indian market of my own. But when I finally opened those doors, almost nobody came. Some people in my own community laughed. They said my shop was too small, too far, too late. For 2 months I sat alone behind that counter, watching an empty room, wondering if I had made the biggest mistake of my life. I never imagined that one quiet decision my own nephew made, without even asking me, would change everything. What happened next, I still don't fully understand. But by the end of this story, you will. My name is Ramesh Desai, and I am 60 years old. I have lived in the United States for 34 years now, longer than I lived in the country where I was born. But there are still mornings when I wake up in my house in Edison, New Jersey, and for just a moment, before my eyes fully open, I smell my mother's kitchen in Anand, the cumin seeds popping in hot oil, the smell of fresh rotli on the tava. Then I remember where I am, and the memory folds itself away, gentle as a letter put back in its envelope. I want to tell you my story honestly, the way I would tell it to a nephew sitting across from me with a cup of chai, not the way these stories sometimes get told in films, with music swelling at exactly the right moment. My life did not move like that. It moved slowly, the way water wears down a stone, one ordinary day after another, for so many years that I sometimes forgot I was even shaping anything at all. I came to America when I was 26 years old. I had a suitcase, $1,100 folded inside a sock, and an address in Jersey City where a distant cousin had agreed to let me sleep on his couch for, as he put it, a few weeks, not a few months. I remember landing at the airport and feeling the cold hit my face like something solid, like a hand. I had never felt cold like that. In Gujarat, even our winters were gentle. That first night in Jersey City, I lay on my cousin's couch under 2 blankets and listened to a radiator clank somewhere in the building, and I thought, what have I done? I had left behind my parents, my 2 sisters, a small but steady job in an accounting office, and a girl I had once hoped to marry but whose family had decided I was not, in their words, settled enough for their daughter. I had nothing to prove to anyone except myself. That, I think, is its own kind of dangerous fuel. It burns hot, but it can also burn you. For the first 11 years, I did not have what you would call a career. I had jobs, one after another, the way a man crosses a river by jumping from stone to stone, never quite certain the next one will hold his weight. I worked nights in a warehouse in Linden, unloading trucks that came in at 3 and 4 in the morning, my hands so cold inside my gloves that I could not feel my own fingers closing around the boxes. I worked as a cashier in a gas station off Route 1 for 2 years, standing behind bulletproof glass, watching the world go by outside, snow falling on the pumps. Men in suits filling their tanks on their way to jobs I imagined paid more in a month than I made in 3. I cleaned office buildings in the evenings after the warehouse shift ended, pushing a cart with a vacuum cleaner through carpeted hallways that smelled like nothing, like nobody, like the absence of a home. I am not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me. I am telling you because I think there are many of you reading this who know exactly what those years felt like. You know what it is to send money home every month, and to never quite explain to your parents how hard you worked for it. Because you did not want them to worry, and because some part of you was ashamed that a man with your education was unloading boxes at 4 in the morning. You know what it is to eat dinner alone in a small apartment, the television on for company more than entertainment, and to wonder if this was truly the bargain you had made when you left everything you knew. I married my wife, Sushila, when I was 31. We had known each other as children in Anand, our families distantly connected through a cousin's marriage, and when I went back for a short visit, my mother arranged for us to meet again, now as adults. Sushila was practical in a way I admired immediately. She did not ask me about romance or poetry. She asked me how much I had saved, what my plan was, and whether I intended to stay in America or eventually return. I told her the truth, which was that I did not entirely know, but that I intended to build something, even if I could not yet say what. She decided to take the chance on me anyway, and I have spent every year since trying to make sure she never regretted it. We had our daughter, Charudata, 2 years later. I know that name is usually given to boys, but my wife's grandfather had carried it, and she wanted to honor him. And in our family, we have never been the kind of people who follow a rule simply because it is the rule. Watching my daughter grow up in this country, attending public schools in Edison, coming home with vocabulary words and friends with names I had never heard before, Accents she would slip into and out of depending on who she was speaking to, taught me something my own immigration never could. I watched her build a life that was neither fully Indian nor fully American, but something new, something that belonged entirely to her. I admired it. I also, if I am honest, sometimes grieved for the version of her that might have grown up running through my mother's courtyard in Anand, a version of her life I had traded away. By the time I was 45, I had been working at a different job, managing inventory for a wholesale food distributor in New Brunswick for almost 9 years. It was steady work. It paid better than anything I had done before. But every single day, I drove past small shops, bakeries, dry cleaners, a hardware store run by an elderly Korean man who waved at me every morning without fail, and I felt something tighten in my chest. Not envy, exactly. Longing is a better word. I wanted something that was mine, not a paycheck that arrived every 2 weeks regardless of whether I had given my best effort or merely enough effort to avoid trouble. I wanted to build a thing with my own hands and watch it either succeed or fail because of what I had put into it. The idea of the market did not arrive suddenly, like lightning. It grew slowly, the way a seed grows, mostly underground, mostly unseen, until one day you notice the small green shoot pushing up through the soil, and you realize it had been working the whole time, even when you could not see it. Sushila and I would drive 40 minutes some Sundays to find specific ingredients. A particular brand of pickle from our region, fresh methi that did not taste like it had traveled across 3 states in a refrigerated truck, the exact kind of jaggery my mother used in her kheer. There were larger Indian grocery stores closer to us, of course, especially the ones clustered along the road everyone calls Little India, but they tended to stock what was popular, what sold in volume, not always what families like mine, from smaller towns in Gujarat, were looking for. I began to believe there was room for something smaller, more personal, more like the shop my own grandfather had run in Anand, where the owner knew your name and what you liked and would set aside the good tomatoes for you before they sold out. It took us 9 more years to save enough. 9 years of small sacrifices that add up, in the end, to something enormous. We did not take vacations. We drove the same car for over a decade, the air conditioning broken for the last 3 years of it, so that every summer drive became its own small endurance test. I picked up extra shifts whenever the distributor offered overtime. Sushila took in tailoring work in the evenings, hemming pants and altering blouses for women in our temple community, her sewing machine humming in the corner of our living room until 11 or 12 at night. We did not tell Charudata, who was a teenager by then, and beginning to notice the differences between her family's life and the lives of her American friends, exactly how tightly we were budgeting. Children should not have to carry that weight. Even when looking back, I think she understood more than we gave her credit for. When we finally had enough saved, along with a modest loan from a community credit union that another Gujarati family had helped me apply for, I found a small commercial space on a quiet side street called Fitzrandolph Avenue. Several blocks away from the busier commercial corridor everyone in our community already knew and frequented. The rent was lower there, which was the entire reason I chose it. I told myself that people would come to find good food and a warm welcome no matter where the shop was located. That word would travel the way it always had in our community, through temples and phone calls and the invisible network of aunties who somehow knew everything happening to everyone within a 50-mile radius. I did not yet understand how much that other street's gravity would work against me, pulling every shopper toward the place they already knew, the parking they already trusted, the habits already worn smooth by years of repetition. We named the shop Anand Provisions, after the town where Sushila and I were both born, and also because the word Anand means joy in Gujarati, and I wanted that to be the first thing people felt when they walked through the door. I spent 4 months renovating the space myself on weekends, building shelves from wood I bought at a lumber yard in Piscataway, painting the walls a warm yellow that reminded me of turmeric, of sunshine, of my mother's kitchen. I imported jars of pickle and spice blends from small producers back home, the kind you could not easily find even at the larger stores. I stocked fresh produce that I drove to a wholesale market in the Bronx to select myself, 3 mornings a week, waking at 4 to make sure I got the best of what arrived. I was 60 years old by the time we opened, an age when many men are beginning to think about slowing down, and here I was, beginning again from nearly nothing, the way I had at 26. The morning we opened in early autumn, I stood behind the counter before sunrise, even though we would not open until 9, simply because I could not sleep and did not want to be anywhere else. I had hung a small string of marigold flowers above the door, the way my grandfather always had for any new beginning. Sushila brought a plate with a small lit diya and walked it slowly around the shop, murmuring a prayer under her breath. And Charudata, now 24 and working as a nurse in New Brunswick, had taken the morning off to be there with us, holding my hand for a moment before customers, we hoped, would begin arriving. I remember the smell of the shop that morning, cardamom and cumin, and the particular sweetness of fresh jaggery, mixed with the sharp scent of new paint that had not entirely faded. I remember thinking, this is the proudest morning of my life. For the first 2 hours, 3 families came in. Each one felt like a small miracle. An older couple bought spices and lingered to talk with me about Anand. It turned out the husband had cousins there. A young mother with 2 children bought snacks for her children and complimented the shelves, which I had built with my own hands and sanded until they were smooth as glass. I felt, in those 2 hours, that everything, all those years of unloading trucks and cleaning office floors and Sushila's sewing machine humming late into the night, had been worth it. Then the hours began to stretch. By the 2nd week I noticed it. By the 4th week, I could not deny it any longer. There were entire afternoons, sometimes from 1 o'clock until 5, when not a single customer walked through my door. I would stand behind the counter, polishing jars that did not need polishing, rearranging spice tins that were already perfectly arranged, simply to give my hands something to do besides shake. I started keeping the radio on, tuned to an Indian music station out of New York, not because I particularly wanted to listen, but because the silence in an empty shop has a particular quality to it, a weight, and I needed something, anything, to push against it. I would watch the door. I do not think I can fully explain to someone who has not done it what it feels like to watch a door for hours hoping it will open, and to feel your heart lift every single time the bell above it chimes, even when it is only the wind, even when it is only a delivery truck idling outside, even when it is, twice that I remember, only a curious dog that had wandered in from the street. I began to dread the sound of my own breathing in that empty room. I began to understand, in a way I never had before, why my father used to say that loneliness is not about being alone, it is about being unseen, unneeded, unchosen, while standing in the exact center of a room you built with your own hands. I told Sushila that business would pick up once people knew we existed. I told myself the same thing every single night, lying awake beside her, doing arithmetic in my head that never came out the way I needed it to. The rent was due regardless of how many customers came. The loan payment was due regardless of how many jars of pickles sold or did not sell. I began to notice, with a particular kind of dread, how much of the fresh produce I drove 4 mornings a week to select was wilting, unsold, by the time I had to throw it away on Friday evenings, standing alone in the back room with bags of spoiled vegetables, doing math that told me exactly how much money I had just thrown into a dumpster behind Fitzrandolph Avenue. I had imagined, foolishly perhaps, that simply being good, being honest, stocking quality goods and treating every customer with warmth would be enough. I was beginning to learn that a small shop on a quiet street, 3 blocks from where everyone already knew to go, can do everything right and still sit in silence, while the world continues on, entirely unaware that it exists at all. It was on a Tuesday evening in late October, almost 2 months after we had opened, that I sat alone in the shop after closing, the security gate halfway down, counting the day's earnings for the 3rd time because I could not believe the number was correct. $41. I had made $41 that entire day. I sat on the small stool behind my counter, in the yellow light I had painted myself, surrounded by shelves of food I had chosen with such care, and for the first time since I had arrived in this country 34 years earlier. As a young man with $1,100 folded into a sock and nothing but stubbornness to guide him, I put my head down on the counter, and I wept. I did not tell Sushila about the $41. I told her the day had been slow but steady, a phrase that, looking back, was probably the first real lie I told her in 29 years of marriage. I wiped my face before I drove home that night, and by the time I walked through our front door, I had arranged my features into something that resembled calm. I had learned, somewhere in my decades of work in this country, how to do that, how to carry weight on the inside while showing nothing on the outside. I think many of you reading this know that particular skill too well. It is, in its own quiet way, a kind of survival. The weeks that followed did not improve, not in any way I could point to with confidence. Some days brought 6 or 7 customers. Other days brought almost none. I began to recognize a pattern, although I did not want to admit what it told me. People in our community were creatures of habit, the same as anyone else. They had been driving to the same shops on the same road for 15, 20, sometimes 25 years. Their mothers had shopped there. Their children had grown up riding in the cart, while their mothers selected vegetables from the same stalls. Loyalty like that does not transfer easily to a new shop on a quiet side street, no matter how good the pickle is, no matter how fresh the methi. What hurt more than the silence, though, was what I started hearing. I do not believe most people intend cruelty. I think, most of the time, people speak carelessly, the way you might step on a small plant in a garden without noticing it was there. But the words land, regardless of intention. One afternoon, an old acquaintance from our temple, a man named Devansh Trivedi, who I had known for almost 15 years, came into the shop, more out of curiosity than need, and walked the empty aisles slowly, his hands in his pockets. "Ramesh, bye," he said, not unkindly, but with the particular bluntness some men mistake for honesty. "You opened this so far from everything. Why would anyone drive past 3 stores they already trust to come find a 4th one they've never heard of? I don't mean to discourage you. I'm only saying what others are already saying." I told him I appreciated his honesty, though something in my chest had gone very still and very cold. He bought a small bag of chickpea flour mostly, I suspected, out of pity, and left. Word, it turned out, traveled in both directions. A friend of Sushila's, a woman she had known from the temple's women's committee for over a decade, mentioned to her at a Diwali gathering that several people had begun referring to my shop, lightly, almost as a joke, as Ramesh's empty room. I do not believe the woman intended for this to reach me, but Sushila, ever practical, ever protective of me in her quiet way, told me anyway, because she believed I deserved to know what I was facing rather than be shielded from it like a child. I sat with that phrase for many nights afterward. Ramesh's empty room. I had built shelves with my own hands. I had painted the walls the color of turmeric. I had named the shop after the town of my birth and the word for joy. And to some of my own community, it had already become a punchline. I want to be clear that this was not most people. Most people in our community said nothing at all, which is its own kind of silence, neither cruel nor kind, simply indifferent. The silence of people with their own struggles, their own children's school fees and their own aging parents and their own lives too full to make room for noticing mine. But it does not take very many unkind words to leave a mark on a man who is already standing at the edge of something. A few careless comments, repeated enough times in enough kitchens, can feel from the inside like the entire world has turned to watch you fail. I began, during those months, to hide more and more of what I was carrying, not just from Sushila, although I minimized things with her too, more than I am proud to admit. I hid it especially from Charadata, who would call most Sunday evenings to check on us. Her voice always quick and warm and slightly distracted, the way young people's voices are when they are building their own lives and trying to hold space for their parents' lives at the same time. When she asked how the shop was doing, I would say, "Building slowly, Beta. These things take time." I did not tell her about the unsold vegetables I threw away every Friday. I did not tell her that I had begun, quietly, to consider whether I would need to ask her for a loan, an idea that filled me with a shame so deep I could not even finish forming the sentence in my own mind. There is a particular loneliness in protecting the people you love from your own pain. You tell yourself you are being strong for them. Some of that is true, but some of it, I have come to believe, is also a kind of pride, a refusal to let anyone see you as anything less than the man who left India with $1,100 and built a life from nothing. I did not want my daughter to see her father as someone who might have made a mistake too large to fix. It was my nephew, Anirudh, who saw what I was hiding before anyone else did. Anirudh was the son of my younger sister, still living in Anand, and he had come to live with us 2 years earlier, at 22 years old, to study computer engineering at a university nearby while working part-time to help cover his costs. He had a quiet, observant manner, the kind of young man who listens far more than he speaks, and who notices things that louder people walk straight past. He had taken to helping at the shop on weekends, restocking shelves, sweeping the floor, occasionally standing at the register so I could step into the back room and breathe for a few minutes without an audience. I think Anirudh had been watching me for weeks before he said anything. He noticed how I checked the cash register 3 and 4 times in an evening, as though the number might change if I looked hard enough. He noticed how I had stopped ordering certain produce because I could no longer bear the cost of throwing it away unsold. He noticed, I learned much later, that I had begun coming home an hour earlier than I told Sushila, not because the shop closed earlier, but because I had started sitting alone in my car in the parking lot for that hour, unable to summon the energy to walk through my own front door and pretend, one more time, that everything was fine. One evening in early December, a Thursday, I remember it was raining, the kind of cold November into December rain that makes the whole world feel gray. I was alone in the shop near closing time, going through the day's receipts, which amounted to $53 across 9 hours. Anirudh had stopped by after his evening class, ostensibly to help me close up, though I suspect now he had come because he was worried and did not yet know how to say so directly. He stood near the doorway for a long moment, watching me sit at the counter with my head in my hands, though I had not realized he was there until he spoke. "Mama," he said, using the word for uncle, his voice gentle in a way that startled me. "How long has it been like this?" I told him I was only tired, that the rain had made for a slow day, the same small lies I had been telling everyone, including, by then, myself. He did not argue with me. He simply nodded and began helping me close the register, and said nothing more about it that night. But I noticed, in the days after, that he had begun arriving at the shop more often, sometimes without explanation, sometimes simply sitting at the small table near the spice shelves doing his coursework while I worked. I think he wanted me to know I was not entirely alone in that empty room, even if neither of us said it aloud. What I did not know, what I would not learn for another 11 days, was that Anirudh had begun quietly recording small pieces of video on his phone during those visits. Not to embarrass me, not for any purpose he could have explained clearly even to himself in the moment, he told me later. He said he simply could not stop thinking about it, about watching his uncle, a man who had crossed an ocean with almost nothing, and spent 34 years building toward this single shop, sitting in silence behind a counter while the world outside walked past the windows without a glance. He had recorded the empty aisles, sunlight falling across shelves I had built and sanded by hand. He had recorded the small bell above the door, perfectly still, no customer's hand ever lifting it. He had recorded, without my knowledge, a few seconds of me standing at the window one evening, watching the street outside, the way a man watches for a letter he has stopped expecting to arrive. He told me later that he had written the words for the video late one night, unable to sleep, the sentences arriving the way grief sometimes arrives, all at once, more than he could properly hold. He described, in his own voice over the footage, what it meant to watch someone you love build something with 34 years of sacrifice, only to watch the world walk past it without noticing. He spoke about warehouses and gas stations and his aunt's sewing machine humming late into the night. He spoke about a string of marigolds above a door on opening morning, and a dia carried slowly through empty aisles. He did not ask anyone to do anything. He simply asked people to imagine what it costs a person to keep showing up, every single day, to a room that refuses to fill. He posted it on a Sunday night, he told me afterward, expecting almost no one to see it. He said he nearly deleted it twice before finally uploading it, worried that I would be angry, worried that he had overstepped some boundary that exists, unspoken between an uncle and a nephew. He went to sleep that night not thinking of it again. I learned about the video 3 days later, on a Wednesday afternoon, standing behind my own counter in my own empty shop, when I looked up to see 4 people I had never met in my life walking through my front door at the same time, 2 of them already crying before they had said a single word to me, and I had no idea, none at all, what had happened, or what was only just beginning. I want to tell you exactly what that Wednesday afternoon felt like, because I have turned it over in my memory so many times since that I am afraid of losing the precision of it, the way a coin loses its detail after being handled too many times. The 4 people who walked in that day were a family, an older couple, and what I took to be their adult son and his wife, and the older woman was already wiping her eyes with a tissue before she had even reached the counter. I assumed, for one confused moment, that something terrible had happened, that perhaps they had mistaken my shop for somewhere else, some place associated with grief. The older man stepped forward and said, in Gujarati, "Bhai, we saw the video your nephew made. We drove from Parsippany. We wanted to be your first customers today." I did not understand. I asked him foolishly what video he meant, and he took out his phone and showed me, and I stood there behind my own counter, in my own shop, watching 41 seconds of my own life, the marigolds, the empty aisles, the bell above the door, Anirudh's voice describing things I had never told him directly, but that he had somehow understood anyway, watching a number climb in small white text at the corner of the screen. A number that, by that point, on that Wednesday afternoon, read over 400,000. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because it was not simple gratitude, not at first. It was something closer to exposure, a feeling of standing in a room with the light suddenly turned on after years of believing I had successfully kept my struggle hidden. My nephew had taken the thing I worked hardest to protect, my dignity, my family's belief that I knew what I was doing, and placed it in front of hundreds of thousands of strangers without asking me. For one entire night, after that family left with 3 full bags of groceries and an embrace I had not expected and could not refuse, I sat with Anirudh in the back room and asked him, quietly, why he had not told me first. He looked down at his hands for a long moment before answering. Mama, I was afraid that if I asked, you would say no, and I could not keep watching you sit alone in this room one more day without trying something. He said he was sorry if he had embarrassed me. He said he would take the video down immediately if that was what I wanted. I did not ask him to take it down. I sat with my own pride for a while, turning it over, examining it the way you examine a stone you are not certain you want to keep carrying. And somewhere in that examination, I understood something I had not let myself understand before. My pride had been costing me something too. It had cost me honesty with my own daughter. It had cost me nights of sitting alone in a parked car instead of walking through my own front door. Perhaps, I thought, it was allowed to cost me a little more, if what it bought in return was a shop that did not have to close. By Friday, 2 days after that first family arrived, the number beneath the video had grown past 1 million. I do not say this to boast. I say it because I still, even now, find it difficult to fully comprehend. I had spent 34 years in this country largely unnoticed, one face among millions, which is, I think, the ordinary condition of most working immigrants. We are not unseen because anyone wishes us harm. We are simply one among so many, each carrying our own version of the same long, quiet effort. To suddenly be seen by so many people at once, for exactly the part of myself I had worked hardest to hide, was disorienting in ways I am still, months later, trying to fully understand. The parking lot outside Anand Provisions, which for 2 months had held nothing but my own car and an occasional stray cat, began filling every single day. Families drove from Parsippany, from Cherry Hill, from as far as Hartford, Connecticut, a drive of nearly 3 hours, to stand in my aisles and fill their carts with spices and pickle and fresh produce I had, for the first time since opening, begun running out of by mid-afternoon. I remember a woman from Stamford telling me she had grown up in a small shop much like mine, run by her own father in a town outside Mumbai, and that watching the video had made her weep at her kitchen table for an hour before she woke her husband and asked him to drive her here the next morning. I remember a young man, perhaps 30 years old, who told me he had never met his own grandfather, who had died before he was born. But that's something about the video. An old man standing alone in a shop he built with his hands had made him think of a grandfather he had never known, and he had cried in his car in my parking lot before coming inside. Local content creators began arriving too, young people with phones mounted on small tripods, asking gently if they could film themselves shopping in the store, always asking first, always respectful, never treating me or my shop as a spectacle, but rather, it seemed to me, as something they genuinely wanted to understand and to honor. A young woman named Bhavana Mehta, who I learned later had built a modest following making videos about small Indian-owned businesses across New Jersey, came and spent 2 hours simply talking with me, asking about Anand, about Sushila's sewing machine, about the lumber I had bought in Piscataway to build my own shelves. She did not ask me anything that felt like exploitation. She asked me the way a granddaughter might ask a grandfather, with real curiosity, and when her video went online 2 days later, it brought another wave of visitors entirely. What surprised me most, and what I think about even now, late at night, more than almost anything else in this entire story, was the response from people who were not Indian at all. I had assumed, if I had assumed anything, that this would remain a story within our own community, understood by us because it was, in some sense, all of our story. But Edison is not only an Indian town. It is a town of many communities living closely alongside one another, and many of my American neighbors, people I had only ever exchanged brief nods with at the gas station or the post office, began arriving too. An elderly man named Walter Okonsky, who lived 2 streets from the shop and whom I had seen perhaps a dozen times over the 2 months we had been open without him ever once stepping inside, came in on a Saturday morning and told me he had watched the video 3 times. He told me his own father had run a small hardware shop in this same town in the 1960s, and that he remembered, as a boy, watching his father stand at the window of an empty store much the way I had. Nobody came to help him, Walter told me, his voice rough. I'm not going to let that happen twice on this street. Not if I can help it. He bought spices he likely had no idea how to use, and asked me with genuine humility to write down simple instructions for him so he could try cooking something himself that weekend. A group of mothers from a nearby elementary school, none of them Indian, organized what they called a neighborhood shopping morning, inviting families from the school to come together one Saturday and do their weekly shopping at my store instead of the larger supermarket most of them used. They did not ask me for anything in return. They simply wanted, one of them told me, to put their money where their hearts were, after seeing the video shared by another parent in their group chat. A small community organization affiliated with a nearby Hindu temple, hearing about the shop's sudden attention, organized a modest cultural evening in the parking lot itself, with 2 local musicians who volunteered their time, playing tabla and harmonium beneath string lights someone had brought from home, while families stood in line to enter the shop, many of them meeting neighbors they had lived near for years without ever speaking to directly. I stood behind my own counter that evening, ringing up purchase after purchase until my hands ached, and looked out at my parking lot, transformed, for one evening, into something that felt less like a business and more like a celebration, and I did not know what to do with the size of what I was feeling. By the following week, I had hired Anirudh on formally, paying him properly for the first time, no longer treating his help as a favor between family. I brought in a second part-time worker, a young woman named Ishani Bhatt, who had recently graduated and was looking for work near her parents' home. I began driving to the wholesale market in the Bronx 5 mornings a week instead of 3, and for the first time since opening, I was selecting more produce than I worried about selling, rather than less. The line outside the shop, on the busiest Saturday of that month, stretched from my front door, down the sidewalk, almost to the corner of Fitzrandolph Avenue, a sight I had imagined, in my most hopeful moments before opening, but had stopped allowing myself to imagine once the silence had set in. I stood at the window that Saturday morning, watching that line of perhaps 60 or 70 people, families with children, elderly couples, young men with phones recording for their own accounts, and I felt something rise in my chest that I had not felt in many months, something I did not immediately recognize because it had been buried under so much worry for so long. It took me a moment to understand what I was feeling. It was hope, returned to me, after I had quietly, privately, given it up. But even as the shop filled, even as the register finally told a different story each evening, I found myself standing alone in the back room one night after closing, the way I always had. And instead of weeping from despair the way I had on that Tuesday in October, I found myself simply standing very still, overwhelmed by a question I had not expected to be asking. After everything, after the silence and the shame and the careful lies I had told the people I loved most, what would I say to Devansh Trivedi, and to the woman from the temple committee, and to everyone who had quietly called my shop, even in jest, an empty room, now that the room would not stay empty at all? It has been almost 4 months now since that Wednesday afternoon, when 4 strangers walked through my door with tears already on their faces, and I find myself, even now, needing to sit quietly some evenings simply to absorb what has happened to my small shop on Fitzrandolph Avenue, and to my own understanding of what I am capable of carrying. Annan Provisions does not sit empty anymore. I want to tell you what an ordinary Tuesday looks like now, because the ordinary days, more than the dramatic ones, are what convince me this is real and lasting, not simply a brief flood of attention that will recede the way floods always eventually do. On an ordinary Tuesday, I arrive at 5 in the morning, as I always have, to receive the produce delivery, and by 9, when we open the gate, there are already 2 or 3 customers waiting outside, something that would have seemed like a fantasy to me only months ago. By midday, the shop is rarely without at least a handful of people moving through the aisles, examining spice tins, asking Ishani about a particular brand of pickle, asking Anirudh, who now manages our small but growing presence online, when the next shipment of a certain jaggery will arrive. By closing most evenings, I am tired in a way I had forgotten was possible. The good kind of tired, the kind that comes from being needed, rather than from carrying the silence of being unneeded. The community that gathered around me did not simply visit once and disappear, the way I had quietly feared they might, once the newness of the story faded. Many of the families who first came because of Anirudh's video have become regular customers, driving from towns 30, 40, even 90 minutes away, not because they cannot find similar groceries closer to home, but because, several of them have told me, they want to remain part of something they feel they helped to build. A woman named Nandita Oza, who first came from Cherry Hill with her elderly mother in the earliest days, now calls ahead most weeks to ask if a particular regional pickle has arrived, and stays each time to talk with me for 10 or 15 minutes about her own mother's kitchen in Surat, a kitchen she has not seen in 20 years. I asked some of my regular customers, in the months since, why this particular story moved them the way it did, because I genuinely wanted to understand it, not simply accept it. A man named Raghavendra Iyer, who drives up most Saturdays from a town nearly an hour south, told me something that has stayed with me. "Ramesh Bhai," he said, "every one of us who came here from India has stood in a room like yours, somewhere, at some point. Maybe not a shop, maybe a job interview nobody called back about, maybe a classroom where nobody understood our accent. Your nephew's video did not show us a stranger's empty shop. It showed us our own empty rooms, the ones we never told anyone about either. I did not have an answer for him beyond gratitude. I am not sure there is a better answer than that. I think often of Walter Okonsky, my American neighbor who came that first Saturday and asked me to write down cooking instructions for spices he had never used. He has become, in his own quiet way, one of my most devoted regulars, and he told me once, standing at my counter with a small bag of cardamom pods in his hand, that watching his own father's hardware shop close decades ago without anyone in the neighborhood stepping forward to help had stayed with him his entire life as a kind of unhealed wound. "I couldn't fix what happened to my dad," he told me, "but I could make sure it didn't happen to you." I did not know, until that moment, that my shop had quietly become, for at least one man on my street, a way of repairing something far older than my own 2 months of empty aisles. I have also had to sit with what it means to face the people who, in those early difficult months, doubted me, sometimes gently, sometimes less gently. Devansh Trivedi, the old acquaintance from Temple who had walked through my empty shop and told me, not unkindly but plainly, that I had chosen a location no one would bother to find, came back in December, several weeks after the video had spread, and stood near the entrance for a long moment before approaching me directly. "Ramesh Bhai," he said, "I want to apologize. I said what I said because I believed I was being realistic, not cruel. But I was wrong about what people would do for someone they respected. I am sorry I did not see what you were building, and I am sorry I did not offer to help instead of offering only doubt." I told him there was nothing to forgive, that he had only said aloud what many people, including some quiet part of myself, had also feared was true. He has become, since then, one of the people who recommends my shop most enthusiastically to others in our Temple community, and I have come to believe that a man who admits he was wrong, and then changes how he acts because of it, deserves more respect, not less, for having doubted in the first place. As for the comment that had hurt me most, the phrase, "Ramesh's empty room," that had traveled through kitchens and phone calls without my knowledge, I never learned exactly which woman had first said it, and I decided, somewhere in the last few months, that I no longer needed to know. I understood, finally, that the words had not been said by someone who wished me harm, but by someone simply repeating an observation that, at the time, had been painfully true. I could not hold anger toward a truth, even an unkind one. I could only be grateful that it was no longer true at all. I think about my nephew, Anirudh, more than almost anyone else in this entire story. I asked him once, sitting together in the back room after closing on a quiet evening in January, why he had taken the risk of filming me without asking, knowing how deeply I valued my privacy, my dignity, my insistence on handling my own burdens quietly. He thought about the question for a long moment before answering. "Mama," he said, "I grew up hearing stories about how you built a life here from almost nothing. I never wanted to see you go silent at the end of that story. I would rather you be angry with me for a little while than watch you disappear into that empty room forever." I did not have words for him in that moment. I simply embraced him, the way I imagine my own father might have embraced me, had he lived long enough to see any of this. Sushila has told me, more than once in these recent months, that she is proudest not of the shop's sudden success, but of what she calls my willingness, finally, to let people see me struggling. "For 29 years, she said to me one evening, folding laundry at our kitchen table, "you have tried to carry everything alone, as though needing help was a kind of failure. Maybe what happened with the shop was not really about the shop at all. Maybe it was the universe finally insisting you learn what the rest of us already knew, that we were never meant to carry these burdens entirely by ourselves. I have turned that thought over many times since, and I believe she is right, though it has taken me 60 years and one very difficult autumn to begin learning it. My daughter, Charudata, came to visit the shop on a Sunday in February, taking a rare day off from her nursing shifts, and stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the aisles full of customers, watching her mother and me both behind the counter, busier than either of us had been in years. She did not say very much. She simply stood there, and then walked over and held both my hands in hers, the way she had on our opening morning so many months earlier. Except this time, neither of us needed to hope. We could simply see, with our own eyes, what had already become true. I think often, late at night, of that Tuesday evening in October when I sat alone in my shop with the security gate halfway down, counting $41 for the third time, certain I had made the largest mistake of my entire life. I did not know in that moment that I was not actually at the end of anything. I was only at the bottom of something, and bottoms, I have come to understand, are not the same as endings. They are simply the place from which the climbing begins, if you are fortunate enough to have people willing to climb alongside you. I do not believe my story is unique. I believe there are small shops on quiet streets in every town in this country, run by men and women who left everything they knew, who worked jobs nobody wanted at hours nobody else would choose, who built something with their own hands and now stand quietly behind their own counters, waiting for a door to open. I do not know if every one of those shops will have a nephew with a phone and a willingness to take a risk on their behalf. I do not know if every one of those stories will be seen by a million strangers. But I have come to believe, more deeply than I believed almost anything else in my 60 years on this earth, that the dignity of that work, the simple, unglamorous, unwitnessed dignity of showing up every single day to a room that refuses to fill, is worth honoring whether or not the world ever notices it at all. What I hope, if you have read this far, is not that you remember my name, or the name of my shop, or even the details of my nephew's video. What I hope is that the next time you pass a small business on a quiet street, one you have never had a reason to enter, you remember that someone, somewhere, gave up everything they once knew to stand behind that counter, and that the smallest gesture of yours, a single visit, a kind word, a willingness to try something unfamiliar, may matter far more than you will ever fully understand. We did not survive because the world suddenly became fair. We survived because, for one season, enough people decided that kindness was worth the small inconvenience of a slightly longer drive. I am 60 years old, and I am only now beginning to understand that this, more than any single dollar I ever saved, is the real inheritance I hope to leave behind.